So I think we will get started. Please get your food and have a time to sit down. It's going to be difficult here. We have a unique situation today, and that is that we are doing this as a co-sponsored event between the Robert Wood Johnson, the Rogers Health Policy Colloquium and the Heberden Society. So let me turn things over first to the Heberden Society.
So thank you all for being here today, both online and in person. I'm Sana Massoud. I'm the head of the Medical Center Archives here at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell. And again, thank you all for being here. And today's lecture, as Dr. Fine said, is we're happy to co-sponsor with the Heberden Society and Rogers Colloquium. The Heberden Society is a history of medicine lecture series that has been held at Weill Cornell Medical Center since 1975. And I would like to thank Dr. David J. Wolf, who is supporting this season this year. And today marks the first lecture of the 2025-2026 season for Heberden. All of our lectures are hybrid, free, and open to the public, and we're always happy to have you join us. Up on the screen is the schedule for the rest of the year. The remaining lectures will be in 2026, and please feel free to ask me any questions about those, and if you would like to register for them online. And if you are interested in the history of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, I please invite you to visit the Medical Center Archives. The archives includes materials dating back to 1771, including this photo of staff digging vehicles out of snow in front of the hospital in the 1950s. Hopefully this is not like something we will have to deal with this year. Probably not. You can find more than 14,000 digitized photographs and documents online through our website. The link is also seen here. And we have even more material available on site in the Medical Center Archives. And I'm really happy to help anybody with planning some research visits, if you just want to find out a little bit more about what we have. So you can also contact the archives at the email noted here. And so thank you again, and I'll turn this over to Dr. Fine to introduce today's lecture. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm really very pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. John Gutiérrez. He is assistant professor and chair of the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York, or CUNY. He is a historian of Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands and specializes in history of Cuba. And specifically the history of health, medicine, and disease during the early 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century, so we're going to go back. This is a historian. He earned his undergraduate degree at Vassar College and his doctorate at the Graduate Center of CUNY, where he was a recipient of the Ralph Bunche Dissertation Fellowship. Before joining the faculty at John Jay, Dr. Gutiérrez was an associate of the Mir Ram Group, specializing in communications and policy analysis. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Friends of the New Jersey Hispanic Research and Information Center at the New Jersey Public Library in Newark. And he joined the center, of the Board of Trustees, rather, of the Amber Charter School in 2015. So Dr. Gutiérrez is going to talk to us today about, quote, roaming around the city, Tuberculosis, Puerto Ricans, and Politics of Disease in the 20th Century, New York City. Let's put our hands together and welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fine. I appreciate those words. So you may be wondering why it is that a guy who focuses on Cuba is lecturing about Puerto Ricans, but I would just direct you to the poetry of Lola Rodriguez del Tio, who referred to Cuba and Puerto Rico as dos alas del mismo pájaro, two wings of the same bird. I want to thank Paul and Sana for their invitation to come here. Nothing motivates an academic to move things from the idea stage to paper than an invitation to a public lecture. I appreciate you for lighting a bit of a fire. And I also want to thank the Heberden Society and the Rogers Health Policy Center for co-sponsoring this series. So let's see here. Oh, I was bound to make a mistake right away. Okay. So, sorry. I'd like to begin my talk today with this image. Behind me, you can see a painting by the celebrated American portraitist Alice Neel, titled TB Harlem. Neel spent a good part of her life living in Harlem, and her art, as the critic Hilton Alls noted some years ago, reflected a deep understanding of affliction. In this case, the afflicted was a man named Carlos Negron, the 24-year-old brother of her lover, the Puerto Rican musician Jose Santiago. Negron had arrived in New York City in 1938, 2 years before becoming Neel's subject. The painting, as you can see, shows Negron laying in bed, looking resignedly at the viewer, his hand resting over his chest, covering a bandage. The bandage covered the wound from his recent thoracoplasty. It's unclear when Negron contracted tuberculosis and whether he arrived in New York City with a latent or active case of the disease. Whatever the circumstances, he was not unique among the hundreds of thousands of Puerto Rican migrants who came to New York City over the course of the 20th century. First by ship, and later in the famed late-night, early morning flights known as the Vuelos Kikiriki, Puerto Ricans came to New York City from an island where tuberculosis was a persistent and stubborn problem. What's more, they arrived in a New York where, especially after the 1920s, tuberculosis seemed to most New Yorkers to be under control. It's this collision between infirmed migrants and a city that wanted to leave tuberculosis in the past that is the subject of my talk today. I think it's important to first lay out the broad outlines of the tuberculosis crisis in Puerto Rico before turning our attention to New York City. After more than 400 years of Spanish colonial rule, Puerto Rico came under the authority of the United States in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-Cuban-American War. In 1902, when the island's governor, William Hunt, submitted his annual report regarding conditions on the island, it was already clear that tuberculosis would pose a challenge. The disease was one of the 3 leading causes of death on the island, alongside enteric diseases and malarial fevers. In the view of US health officials and their Puerto Rican counterparts, the island seemed especially hospitable to the bacillus. As in all other places, the president of Puerto Rico's Superior Board of Health noted, quote, "Tuberculosis is the great and fatal scourge of Puerto Rico. And under the peculiar conditions here, the difficulties in the way of checking its ravages are great. Sleeping in crowded rooms, which are invariably sealed up at night against any possible entrance of air, the people expose themselves to every possible risk of contagion. The personal habits of the poorer classes," he continued, "are in favor of contagion through the dissemination of sputum, and attempts to change those habits are almost invariably a failure," end quote. Subsequent annual reports detailed attempts to address the disease, including the work of the island's fledgling anti-tuberculosis league, creating a network of dispensaries, and the construction of a sanatorium on the outskirts of San Juan for the consumptive poor. In 1909, when tuberculosis accounted for almost 10% of all deaths on the island, the American governor, George R. Colton, appealed to a higher authority by declaring April 24th as quote unquote Tuberculosis Sunday and asking churches to call quote attention to the necessity of taking every measure possible to eradicate the white plague. It appears those prayers fell on deaf ears. In the early 1920s, the US Public Health Service conducted an island-wide survey of tuberculosis and found not only that the disease was widespread, but also that the scope of infection and mortality was difficult to accurately assess because, among other factors, compulsory notification of infection was lax, and because many Puerto Ricans feared association with the disease. The phthisis phobia existing among the people, the survey report noted, quote, and that dread of having the true condition known with an effort to avoid inspectors' visits after a death from tuberculosis often caused the parties interested to mask conditions and to give symptoms suggestive of a diagnosis of malaria or hookworm. Consequently, the death rate from tuberculosis as recorded may be considered a minimum. Puerto Rico's high rate of infection and mortality from tuberculosis in the first part of the 20th century was difficult to square with the declines seen elsewhere. While the death rate on the mainland US, and indeed even in places such as Cuba and Mexico, systematically declined during these years, Puerto Rico was something of an outlier. As Eduardo Garrido Morales, Puerto Rico's Commissioner of Health, noted in 1935, quote, in many other countries, the death rate from tuberculosis, especially during the past 25 years, has had a downward trend. But in Puerto Rico, it has shown a steady rise, end quote. The annual average death rate was 171 deaths per 100,000 in the period between 1910 and 1914. The rate was 295 deaths per 100,000 in the period between 1930 and 1934. That last rate, as Garrido Morales noted, was approximately 5 times the death rate from tuberculosis in the US registration area. By the time Governor James Beverly submitted his annual report in 1934, the problem seemed intractable, and the language used to describe the crisis closely mimicked the language used more than 3 decades earlier at the start of US imperial control over the islands. Quote, the problem of tuberculosis is the most serious problem faced by the people of Puerto Rico, Beverly wrote, but unfortunately, it is not merely a health problem. Tuberculosis control in Puerto Rico will depend upon economic conditions rather than upon medical efforts, end quote. Perhaps no group understood better the underlying causes of Puerto Rico's tuberculosis crisis than Puerto Rican physicians. Among these, one of the most important voices drawing a connection between poverty and disease was Jose Rodriguez Pastor. Educated at UVA and at Jefferson Medical College, Rodriguez Pastor had spent time studying at the Trudeau School of Tuberculosis at Saranac Lake before returning to Puerto Rico in 1925 to take over the tuberculosis division of the Puerto Rico Health Department, a position he would occupy until 1942. In 1937, Rodriguez Pastor published a survey of the tuberculosis problem in Puerto Rico in the American Review of Tuberculosis, the field's leading journal. His assessment focused on 3 points. First, extreme poverty was driving the tuberculosis crisis, especially as it related to overcrowded housing. Second, the island's tuberculosis mortality rate tended to spike after hurricanes, when an already bad overcrowding problem became even worse for the island's poor. And finally, and importantly for our purposes today, tuberculosis was following Puerto Ricans to New York. As Rodriguez Pastor wrote, quote, in the city of New York, tuberculosis among the Puerto Ricans is a serious problem, end quote. During the 2-year period between 1931 and 1932, he added, when there were 45,000 Puerto Ricans living in New York City, the tuberculosis death rate among them was 434 per 100,000 population, over 6 times the tuberculosis death rate of the city as a whole, end quote. The connection that Rodriguez Pastor made between the scale of tuberculosis infection on the island and the growing migration of Puerto Ricans to New York City would become something of a leitmotif over the course of the next several decades as the destinies and populations of New York and Puerto Rico became ever more tightly bound together. The question of the housing issue. Sorry, I keep on getting these wrong. The poor housing in Puerto Rico was obvious to policymakers in Washington and in San Juan. It also became a subject for American artists. And there are two good examples of this. These are two photographers. The first, Jack Delano, who was born in Russia and was a member of the WPA and spent most of his adult life chronicling Puerto Rico. And you can see here that he has taken an image in 1942 of one single family that is living in this one house with, it appears, one room near a sugar plantation just outside of Ponce on the southern part of the island. And then another image, this one, a later one from 1952, from Rómulo La Chatañere, a rural Puerto Rican family of 6. And this is another example of the sort of really miserable housing conditions that confronted most Puerto Ricans during the 1940s and 1950s and continuing for several decades afterwards. If early 20th century Puerto Rico was a frustrating example of the durability of tuberculosis, New York City offered something of a different vision. In 1952, Gutiérrez Drolet and Anthony Lowell, two prominent statisticians and leaders in the anti-tuberculosis movement in the city, published an assessment of tuberculosis in New York. The report, a half century's progress against tuberculosis in New York City, 1900 to 1950, which you can see here, was published by the New York Tuberculosis and Health Association and detailed the dramatic decrease in New York's tuberculosis death rate. In 1804, the death rate from pulmonary tuberculosis was 688 per 100,000. By 1900, the rate had dropped to 237 per 100,000. The decline in tuberculosis mortality continued during the first 5 decades of the 20th century. In 1900, tuberculosis ranked second among the leading causes of death in New York City. By 1950, the disease had dropped to 7th place in the rankings. The transformation that took place in New York City with regard to tuberculosis mortality was, according to Baron Lerner, the product of 3 key interventions, quote, the screening of at-risk populations, supervised therapy, and the forced detention of infectious persons, end quote. Ironically, success bred apathy. As Lerner points out, by the 1930s, with mortality at historic lows, the attention of the public and some civic leaders was directed elsewhere, especially toward non-communicable diseases such as cancer. One result of this false sense of victory over the disease was that the city invested less and less in the care of tubercular patients. Hospital beds were difficult to find, nursing care became more scattered. For the poor in particular, the lack of regular supervised care and effective interventions meant that many New Yorkers continued to live and work with the disease and serve as agents of infection. For Drolet and Lowell, the problem, in part at least, was one of framing. By looking at the declining death rate from tuberculosis, city leaders seem to have made the assumption that they had also limited the spread of the disease as well. Drolet and Lowell, and indeed much of the New York City medical establishment, knew different. Looking at the death rate from the disease instead of the rate of new cases registered offered a skewed picture of the tuberculosis problem. Is it not time, Drolet and Herbert Edwards wrote in 1950, quote, that we raise our sights from the cemeteries and the premature graves to the living tuberculous who really need our attention and for whom we can still do something? I've managed to mess this up again. So if you take a look, this is actually from Drolet and Lowell's survey. And you can see that if policymakers were simply looking at the collapse of the death rate, which is the bottom line, you would think that the disease had sort of disappeared from New York City. But the new case rate, which appears at the top part of the graph, shows that yes, there's a decline, but it's a much more, it's a much slower decline, a much more subtle decline with some increases, particularly at the moments when Puerto Ricans are arriving in the city. Among those living tuberculosis, newcomers to the city drew the attention of people like Drolette. Quote, the vast horde and streams of population which have gone through and into New York City during the last 50 years, he and Lowell wrote, the type and composition of these groups, the limited space available to them for dwelling purposes, have all combined to make extremely difficult the control of a communicable disease like tuberculosis, end quote. Partly driven by a search for better economic opportunities and partly forced from the island as a matter of policy, hundreds of thousands of Puerto Rican migrants arrived in New York City in the years before and immediately after the Second World War. Between 1940 and 1950, the Puerto Rican population in the city grew by more than 300%. Between 1950 and 1960, it grew by another 150%. No other group in the city experienced such explosive growth. That growth prompted concern and no small amount of public discussion and criticism about the impact that Puerto Rican migrants were having on the city. As my former CUNY colleague Edgardo Melendez has written, the public debate about what was called the quote unquote Puerto Rican problem reflected post-World War II anxieties in the city and no small amount of racial and ethnic animosities as well over the arrival of migrants from the island who were considered burdens on the city's housing stock, its public schools, its relief rolls, and its hospitals. Puerto Ricans were framed as agents of juvenile delinquency, vectors of transmission for venereal diseases, and importantly, for our purposes, new sources of contagion when it came to tuberculosis. Lawrence Chenot, one of the earliest researchers on the emerging Puerto Rican community in New York City, was among the first to draw an explicit connection between tuberculosis and Puerto Ricans. His book, The Puerto Rican Migrant in New York City, included a section that examined the health of the island. Of all of the maladies buffeting the island, and by extension its migrants in New York City, none was as significant to Chenot as was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, he wrote, was, quote, the outstanding health problem of the Puerto Rican in New York as on the island, end quote. While the New York City Department of Health had yet to collect data about Puerto Ricans specifically, Chenot evaluated healthcare indicators in the city's health center districts, where large numbers of Puerto Ricans lived. From there, the data painted a grim picture. He wrote, quote, the death rate from all causes in all of these areas is much higher than that of the entire city and generally higher than that of Manhattan. Infant mortality rates for these areas are higher than those for the entire city and for Manhattan. And as for tuberculosis, he continued, the mortality rates are in every case double the rate for the entire city, and in some cases are almost 4 times as great, end quote. Chenot went on to argue that the health center district data suggested that the mortality rates for tuberculosis among Puerto Ricans in New York appear to be as fully high as on the island. And in some areas of the city, he argued the mortality rate was higher than on the island and on par with the urban areas of Puerto Rico. Chenot made an additional point, which bears mentioning here. The tuberculosis problem was acute for Puerto Ricans on the island, but it was worsened by the conditions that greeted them when they arrived in New York City. These migrants were forced, he wrote, quote, by their economic condition upon entering this country to live in conditions which afford a ready medium for the transmission of the disease, end quote. If, as Wade Hampton Frost had argued a year before Chenot at the annual meeting of state and local committees on tuberculosis and public health in New York, the essential strategy of tuberculosis prevention remained, quote unquote, avoidance of exposure, then the Puerto Rican migrants coming to New York and segregated into substandard housing would find it nearly impossible to shield themselves from infection. Municipal authorities were confronted not just with the stark statistical reality of tuberculosis in the city's Puerto Rican communities, but also with its political fallout. Puerto Rican communities were already regarded by many in the city as repositories of violence and uncleanliness. Now they were increasingly seen as dangers to the health of all New Yorkers. In one report in the New York Times, the leaders of the New York Tuberculosis and Health Association warned that thousands of active cases of tuberculosis were, quote unquote, roaming around the city. The sense of dread surrounding Puerto Rican migrants led individual New Yorkers to express their consternation at the Puerto Rican tuberculosis problem. Howard C. Reese, for example, lived in his family's apartment on East 96th Street within a couple of city blocks of Metropolitan Hospital and less than a dozen blocks from El Barrio, the heart of New York's Puerto Rican community. Early in the fall of 1948, he sent a letter to Mayor William O'Dwyer. Quote, although you are doubtless aware of the alarming health conditions among the Puerto Rican population in the city, he wrote, I would like to remind you, sir, that unless corrective measures are employed shortly, a serious epidemic of tuberculosis may break out, end quote. Reese went on to explain that city hospitals were seeing increasing numbers of tuberculosis patients who were, he wrote, principally Puerto Ricans, before noting that the overrepresentation of Puerto Ricans as food handlers in the city's hotels and restaurants made the problem of their tuberculosis infection, quote, all the more acute, end quote. Your Honor knows, he added, that no health examinations are required for Puerto Ricans coming here from Puerto Rico, yet the influx continues while overcrowding prevails in their neighborhood. O'Dwyer's office referred the letter to the mayor's health commissioner, Dr. Harry Mustard. Let me assure you, Dr. Mustard responded to Reese, that the Department of Health is not unmindful of the problem to which you refer. Some months ago, he continued, I appointed within the Department of Health a special committee to deal with such problems, and they have made rather excellent progress. Still, he warned Reese, quote, the problem is not one that lends itself to immediate solution, end quote. Puerto Ricans, both in New York City and on the island, pushed back against arguments that positioned them as little more than infectious citizens. Less than 1 year before the exchange between Reese and Dr. Mustard, Dr. Rafael Angel Marin, a Puerto Rican physician who lived just a few short blocks from Reese and whose medical practice was located on 110th Street, had himself written Dr. Mustard. Unlike Reese, however, Dr. Marin was not writing to warn about the threat posed by tubercular Puerto Ricans. Instead, he wrote to call the commissioner's attention to the increasing identification of Puerto Ricans as agents of disease infection and transmission, and the negative consequences that would befall them if the New York City Health Department didn't, quote, ameliorate the harm caused by half-truths, inaccuracies, and misrepresentations, end quote. The subject I'm placing before you, Dr. Marin wrote, quote, involves the welfare of hundreds of New York employers and thousands of Puerto Rican employees who are already feeling the pressure which publicity purportedly coming from your department has brought to bear on them. More Puerto Ricans have been driven to my office for health certificates during the past 2 weeks than during the past 2 years. Some of them are beginning to notice that doors which were once open to them are now closed, end quote. Dr. Marin went on to list a half a dozen misconceptions about Puerto Ricans and their health that he had gathered from recent conversations with health officials. And he requested that Dr. Mustard issue a quote, constructive and accurate statement that would dispel hysteria. I would not expect you to betray the truth one way or another, he concluded. We are not afraid of the truth. Leaders on the island also sought to contextualize, if not necessarily reject, the connection between Puerto Ricans and tuberculosis. In May 1949, the island's resident commissioner, Antonio Fernosi Cern, addressed the New York Tuberculosis Association. Fernosi Cern knew the health conditions on the island perhaps better than most officials, after having served in the Puerto Rico Department of Health since the 1920s and serving as commissioner first from 1931 to 1933 and again from 1942 to 1946. The New York Times reported that the resident commissioner said that, quote, the threat of increasing tuberculosis in New York posed by an influx of immigrants from Puerto Rico is a problem that must be handled by improving the economic status of the island, end quote. Some weeks after Fernosi Cern's speech, the Times editorial page itself published an op-ed titled Puerto Rico and TB. Tuberculosis has been increasing of late, the editorial began. One reason may be the conditions that prevail in Puerto Rico, whence come too many physically unfit migrants. New York might not be able to restrict the arrival of Puerto Rican migrants, but the federal government could do more to strengthen the island's economy so as to, quote, reduce migration to a desirable minimum. The city's authorities wrestled with the best way to approach the issue. On the one hand, they knew that the most important and effective way to deal with the spread of disease in Puerto Rican communities was to improve the economic and living conditions of migrants. Organizations such as the Welfare Council of New York called on the city to address the education, employment, and housing issues confronting migrants as a way, quote, to avert a further aggravation of conditions within New York City. For its part, the New York City Department of Health increased outreach to help address the fear that seemingly gripped the community around the disease. Health district offices launched studies of the community's health needs and began to hire Spanish-speaking workers. And as we see, and let's see if I can actually get this right. Yes, okay. And as we see in these images from the New York City Municipal Archives, the health department launched a robust education campaign in Puerto Rican communities like East Harlem, publishing guides in Spanish explaining the etiology of the disease and the threat that it posed to families. It's unclear what impact these attempts at disease education had. What is clear is that in the 20 years between 1948 and 1968, the active case rate in the city dropped from 109 per 100,000 to 36 per 100,000. And that among Puerto Ricans during the same period, the rate dropped from 253 per 100,000 to 44 per 100,000. Still, in 1968, tuberculosis rates in New York were higher than for any other large city in the country. Mayor John Lindsay convened a group of experts to study the issue. The commission of experts reported that it found, quote, reservoirs of tuberculosis, end quote, in neighborhoods like the South Bronx, East Harlem, and Central Brooklyn, the very neighborhoods where thousands of Puerto Ricans lived. 2 years later, in the spring of 1970, members of the Young Lords seized a mobile chest X-ray unit in East Harlem. This is an image from the Puerto Rican photographer Iram Maristani, who kind of chronicled a lot of the work of the Young Lords and other parts of Puerto Rican life in the 1960s and 70s. We were forced to take this move. Pablo Yoruba Guzman, the Minister of Information for the Young Lords, was quoted as saying in the New York Times, because, quote, the city has refused to help us in our backup program in tuberculosis examinations. The Young Lords' appropriation of the mobile testing unit, to say nothing of its renaming as the Ramon Emeterio Betances health truck, was part of what historian Johanna Fernandez has called the organization's quote unquote tuberculosis activism. Focusing on a disease that had battered their community, the Young Lords made anti-tuberculosis work a key part of their campaign to demonstrate government indifference, quote, government indifference to the needs of city residents, end quote. Ironically, the Young Lords' actions happened in a year when the new active case rate for Puerto Ricans in the city was 37.3 per 100,000, the lowest rate recorded in more than 25 years. Still, that rate was higher than it was for the city as a whole and more than double the rate for white New Yorkers. The Young Lords' actions that day also served as a bitter coda to what had been a decades-long struggle to fight tuberculosis among Puerto Rican New Yorkers. The seizure of the mobile X-ray unit was a short-lived success. While hundreds of Puerto Ricans were tested for tuberculosis in the days following the seizure, the broader goal of increasing tuberculosis surveillance in the community floundered as New York's financial position weakened. Some months after the events in East Harlem, Mayor Lindsay, faced with increasingly powerful economic headwinds, ordered the health department to cut its budget, including discontinuing the mobile service unit program. Thank you. Yes. Hi. Okay. Okay.
First week.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to guide with the manual that we were given. It turns out that he had pulmonary tuberculosis throughout his thorax. All 4 students converted on PPD positive
It's true too.
Because we had Lincoln first.
Right.
So your talk to me has somewhat personal.
I can see that. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure.
I recall working at Kings County Hospital. Was there there were also a lot wondering the focus. It seems to me that this was probably more accomplished.
It was.
Could you give us some idea of the relative?
Well, in even as late as 1970, when the new case rate among Puerto Ricans had declined, it was still about half of the new case rate for African Americans in the city. There had been a long-standing debate in the public health community going back to the beginning of the 20th century about the connection between Blackness and tuberculosis, some of which was profoundly racist and informed by ideas of social Darwinism. But in New York, a lot of the early work around tuberculosis prevention focused on African Americans. I think the reason that I have been attracted to this topic is because I think that there's a general I don't want to say silencing, but there's an overlooking of the historical position of Puerto Ricans here. And I think that the connection to the island, the back and forth movement for migrants poses some interesting questions for historians of public health. So for me, if I had put up the data on African Americans, it would have made the Puerto Rico problem sort of pale in comparison. But we haven't talked a lot about Puerto Rican health in New York City, and so I think it's something to talk about. Yep. Other questions?
Other questions?
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, here. Can we give you the mic?
Thank you for the talk. I guess I'm not sure if you know this, but I was wondering what role like latent tuberculosis or recurring tuberculosis with like origin of infection in Puerto Rico had in the new cases in New York.
Meaning that the people who are arriving here were already arriving with. I think there are a couple of studies done in Puerto Rico. The 1920 study by the U.S. Public Health Service found astronomically high rates of infection, most of which, let me not say most of which, many of which were latent cases, right? I think that there was another study done at the University of Puerto Rico where you would think that the class issue would have sort of had a different effect on the rate of infection. And even at the University of Puerto Rico, the tuberculin positive rates were incredibly high. So my guess is that many, if not most, of the Puerto Ricans who arrived in New York City had latent infection. The disease was so pervasive on the island that I don't think there was a place that you could hide from infection. And I think that combined with the poor housing conditions and poor access to healthcare here in New York City made the problem exponentially worse for people. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Two quick questions and one bigger question, I guess. So what are rates of TB like now in Puerto Rico? And second question is, because Puerto Ricans are US citizens, I'm assuming they never had to give x-rays, chest x-rays before?
They did not.
Okay.
There was no health screening for them as they came to the mainland.
That makes them somewhat unique, right?
It did.
Okay.
And it made them also a target for people like Reese, who was very aware of the fact that people were arriving in New York City not having been screened.
And then,
I don't know the answer, by the way, to your first question. One of the nice things about being a historian is that I can deal with the past and I don't necessarily have to look at.
I'm assuming they're lower. I'm just curious how much lower in comparison to New York City in general they are. But
That's a good question. I don't know. I wouldn't make the assumption that it was lower. I only say that because I think that I remember in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when we were in the middle of the HIV/AIDS crisis, where the infection rates in Puerto Rico were astronomical compared to rates in New York City.
for HIV,
For HIV, so much so that, and this caused a political problem in New York, in part because Medicaid reimbursement rates in Puerto Rico were much lower than they were in New York. Many doctors in Puerto Rico did not provide care for people who had HIV/AIDS. So what would happen is, because Puerto Ricans could get to New York easily, hop on a plane, come to New York, you had an increase in the infection rate in Puerto Rican communities in New York City, largely driven by the arrival of Puerto Ricans who were looking for healthcare that they couldn't receive on the island. So I think I just wouldn't make the assumption that the rates are that much lower.
and so in the 20th century, was TB more common in Puerto Rico than the other Caribbean nations like Cuba?
I mean, much more common than Cuba. Cuba mounts a pretty significant anti-TB campaign in the early part of the 20th century, to say nothing of what happens after 1959, and it becomes something of a model. There are sanatoria, there are doctors who are involved in the International Congress on Tuberculosis, actively participating in public health debates here in the U.S. about how to control the disease. It's a sort of a really different story, and something that I think raises questions about the effectiveness of U.S. imperial rule, right? All of this is happening while Puerto Rico is under the control of the United States. One would think that an independent nation in the Caribbean wouldn't have as good healthcare indicators in the early part of the 20th century as Cuba had, when Puerto Rico has the United States behind it, and that's not the case. Yes. Hi.
Other questions? Yes.
Hey, John.
Hey.
John's a coworker or former coworker of my wife, Kathy.
Yes.
Ed Figueroa. I'm a family medicine physician. Also have a public health degree. And I remember in my studies, we constantly heard about the so-called Latino paradox or the Hispanic health paradox, where coming from a Latin American country provided certain protections when they arrived to the US and better health indicators and health outcomes. Didn't seem like that was the case for Puerto Ricans, and was wondering if you had any thoughts on maybe why that might be.
No, I think a lot of it revolves around the economic conditions here. If you looked at data from the New York City Department of Health around new case rates, and you were to map them, you would see that the poorer areas of the city, Mott Haven, Morrisania, East Harlem, Central Brooklyn, those were the places where the disease sort of remained strongest. And those also happened to be the places where you had large Puerto Rican communities. I think this direct line from Puerto Rico to places where the housing was substandard, where the access to healthcare wasn't very strong, and the poverty. I think those factors, they undid whatever protections, to the extent that there was any, that Puerto Ricans may have had against full-blown cases of TB on the islands. That's my sense.
Let me just ask.
Sure.
Not so much a question, but an observation that's interesting out of my own experience, having done a residency in Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. one of the fascinating things there was that we developed as residents at that time, this was in the 1970s, a home visiting program in which we did PPDs on, any family that was willing to have it done, so that students and residents played a real role in trying to do prevention.
That was one of the key demands of the Young Lords when they took over Lincoln Hospital. They take over the hospital just about 2 months after they seized this mobile X-ray unit,
Yes.
and so for them, they really wanted to get the hospital into communities. So I'm not surprised to hear your experience, because they really wanted doctors to step outside of the hospital and go into buildings and test people and provide care there. So what they called prevent. There's an article on this in the Young Lords newspaper Palante about we're pushing for preventive medicine, right? Which seems so revolutionary in 1970, and I guess does not seem that revolutionary today.
Oh, it's really very interesting. Can you imagine? And this actually did happen July 14th, 1970, or it may have been 69. The Young Lords Party actually took over the hospital, Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. They arrived around, I think 5 or 6 in the morning. Mm-hmm. Actually drove up in a truck and discharged about 20 or so of their members, that then went to the various parts of the hospital and literally got the administrators out and took over the institution. It was quite an amazing experience. And again, we know this because some of us as residents were there and saw this takeover.
Right.
By 5 o'clock, though, in the afternoon, what had happened was that they had begun to negotiate with the mayor and the Department of Health for the building of a new hospital. Lincoln was one of the oldest hospitals in the United States. It ran on direct current, not on alternating current. Can you imagine that? It was one of the institutions that really needed to be replaced. And the Young Lords Party negotiated this with the mayor and the health department. And indeed, a new Lincoln Hospital was opened in 1974-75.
Right.
Amazing experience.
They also managed to put a Puerto Rican medical director, to get the city to appoint a Puerto Rican medical director, which was unheard of for the medical establishment at Lincoln. They were not particularly pleased with this.
Well, what happened was really that the pediatrics department is the department that actually had a Puerto Rican chief that was appointed. And her name was Helen Rodriguez.
Helen Rodriguez Trias, yes, of course.
And she became very well known as a public health force in the country. She's somebody that was very well respected by many of us who were in training.
I think she may have ended up being the first Latina president of the American Public Health Association.
Yes, that is very possible to be the case, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, Dr. Wolf, here, why don't you, before you make any statement, use the mic.
Dr. Fines reminds me of something I think you'd find very interesting, and as a historian, I'd like your opinion. I did a rotation at Metropolitan Hospital in the early 1970s as a medical student. And the students were involved in a sort of in a way that I'll never forget. In those days, not all, but many of the residents working in the emergency room were foreign medical graduates. They were either, a good many of them were either Indian or Pakistani. Not all of them, their English was not so good. And I don't think any of them could speak or understand Spanish. And I recall a lot of the Hispanic patients coming into that emergency room, often not being able to speak much English, let alone Pakistani or Indian.
Right.
And it was huge communication problems between the resident staff and the Hispanic patients. The typical thing would be a mother who's bringing her child in with asthma, and the child was, in a lot of distress, and the mother was very anxious, and there was a lot of commotion, and and the medical students like me, we were thrown into the middle of it because neither the residents could deal with it, or many of the Hispanic, particularly mothers, and some of the medical students knew a little Spanish, which helped. I didn't know any Spanish. I took French when I went to college. Right. And it was one of the most challenging problems that I ever had to deal with.
It was actually an enormous
I just want to mention it. Yeah. So I don't know from a historical point of view.
In 1968, when Lindsay convenes his tuberculosis commission, there are hearings held all over the city. And in one hearing, the chairman of the committee asks a Puerto Rican nurse from East Harlem, who actually worked at Metropolitan Hospital, about the biggest challenge that she faced. And she said, the biggest challenge that we face is that we have doctors who can't speak Spanish. And so she said there was no way to reach patients, and that patients felt really uncomfortable. I mean, I think we take for granted things like linguistic and cultural competency now, but in 1969, 1968 in New York, there were a lot of patients who walked out of hospitals because they felt that they couldn't be understood. So, any other questions?
So, one other question.
Sure.
Do you know Lincoln Hospital? Which academic health center is it affiliated with today?
I want to say Einstein. Is that?
No.
Okay.
Definitely not Einstein.
Okay.
It is Cornell.
Oh, there you go.
And the interesting thing is that that affiliation, we still send people in psychiatry up to Lincoln. Oh, you know about this? Yeah. And that's largely, again, because of the addiction levels. And they're one of the few institutions that actually has an addiction program. We don't send many students there today. One of the problems that led us into a little bit of difficulty with the reviewing agencies was the complaint that one student had that, when I went on rounds, the doctors and the patients only spoke Spanish. I didn't understand any Spanish.
Time to learn Spanish.
Yes. Well, that's what we felt, right. Or those of us who were supervising, but we had troubles when there were complaints about the quality of care at, the student experience around quality of care. Well, thank you a lot, Dr. Gutierrez. I want to say that we would like to give you a
Oh, lovely.
David Rogers Health Policy Colloquium
Thank you.
medallion.
Thank you very much. It's lovely of you. It's been great to be here. And thank you all for coming in for your questions. It's always nice to present new work. So I really appreciate your feedback and your questions. Thank you all. You're
And next week, if I'm correct, we will be back at 1305 to hear Eric Kushner, who is going to talk to us about Mount Sinai's program, in harm reduction policy and practice for people who use drugs. Eric is an alumnus. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Look forward to seeing you all then.
Thanks for coming.